The first round hit the lead Suburban at 8:47 hours, and by the time the smoke cleared from the engine block, Marcus Highland knew his motorcade wasn't getting out of the Cunnar Valley alive. The billionaire sat in the third vehicle, knuckles white against Italian leather, watching his security detail scramble into defensive positions behind bulletproof doors that wouldn't matter against what was coming. Outside, the mountains pressed in like teeth, and somewhere in those ridges, men with RPGs were calculating trajectories. Highland's head of security, a former Delta operator named Vance, was screaming coordinates into a radio, his voice climbing an octave with each repetition. The convoy had been traveling under State Department protection, a goodwill tour of reconstruction projects that was supposed to demonstrate American commitment to Afghan infrastructure. Instead, it had become a perfectly orchestrated kill box, 3 disabled vehicles on a road barely wide enough for one, with a rockslide blocking their rear and small arms fire pouring down from elevated positions that had probably been prepared for days. Highland had built his fortune on risk assessment, on reading markets and predicting chaos, but nothing in his glass tower in Manhattan had prepared him for the specific terror of being a static target in hostile terrain. Vance was still on the radio, calling for immediate air support, for anything in the vicinity, for a miracle that probably wasn't coming because this sector was supposed to be quiet, because the real fights were happening 2 provinces over, because nobody had thought to maintain a combat air patrol over what was supposed to be a simple photo opportunity. Then someone on the radio said a call sign that made Vance go quiet. Reaper 27, single ship A-10, 6 minutes out. The voice was female, calm as someone ordering coffee, and even through the static and the gunfire, Highland caught the edge of something in Vance's expression. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Maybe concern. One of the younger security contractors, a kid from Georgia who'd been talking about his girlfriend 3 minutes before the ambush, actually laughed. They sent Reaper. Jesus, somebody really wants us dead. Vance didn't respond, just kept scanning the ridgeline with binoculars, looking for the shooters they all knew were there, waiting for whatever was about to happen. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound every ground soldier knows, the distinctive rumble of turbofans that sounds like God clearing his throat before speaking. The A-10 was coming. 6 minutes earlier, Captain Sienna Reeves had been flying a boring CAP pattern at 12,000 feet, letting her warthog drone through the thin air while she mentally composed her resignation letter. She'd been writing versions of it for 3 months now, ever since the incident at Bagram, since the colonel had made it clear that her career ceiling was exactly where she was sitting right now, flying circles over empty mountains while male pilots half her experience flew the real missions. The radio call came through on guard frequency, panicked and compressed, and she was already banking hard before the coordinates finished transmitting. Her wingman had peeled off 20 minutes ago for a fuel issue, leaving her solo, which was probably why they'd called her at all. She was available, which in military terms meant expendable. The JTAC on the ground was painting targets before she even had visual, his laser designator splashing infrared markers across 3 separate positions in the rocks. Reeves descended through 8,000 feet, her hands moving across switches and toggles with the muscle memory of 4 combat deployments, prepping the GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the aircraft's entire reason for existing. The A-10 wasn't elegant, wasn't fast, wasn't anything except a flying gun with just enough airplane attached to keep it airborne, and right now that was exactly what someone needed. Reaper 27, we have enemy combatants in prepared positions, estimate 15 to 20 fighters, RPGs confirmed. They're about to light us up. The JTAC's voice was steady, but she could hear the subtext, the way every ground soldier sounds when they're calculating how many seconds they have left. She pulled up the targeting pod feed, saw the convoy trapped on the road, saw the muzzle flashes from the ridge, saw exactly how bad this was about to get. Copy all, I have visual, starting my run from the north, keep your heads down. She didn't mention that she was alone, that doctrine said you never ran close air support without a wingman, that she was about to violate approximately 7 different engagement protocols. She just rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dropped into the valley like a falling anvil. The mountains came up fast, rock faces streaming past her canopy close enough that she could see individual boulders, and somewhere in her peripheral vision she registered the convoy, the disabled vehicles, the men crouched behind inadequate cover. Then she was pulling the trigger, and the Avenger spoke with a sound like the sky tearing in half. The cannon fired at 65 rounds per second, each projectile the size of a milk bottle, and the effect on the ridgeline was biblical. Rock exploded, dust geysered 50 feet into the air, and the enemy positions that had seemed so secure simply ceased to exist under a stream of depleted uranium that hit with more kinetic energy than some explosives. Reeves walked the fire across the entire northern slope, feeling the airframe shudder with recoil, watching the destruction through her heads-up display with the detached focus that came from doing this so many times that it had become almost meditative. She pulled out of the gun run with maybe 300 feet to spare, felt the stick respond sluggishly in the thin air, and was already setting up for the second pass before her first shells stopped falling. The radio erupted with chatter, multiple voices trying to talk at once, but she filtered it down to just the JTAC. Good hits, you got at least 6, but we've got more on the southern ridge they're trying to flank. She banked hard, scanning for the new threat, finding it exactly where she'd expect it, fighters trying to reposition while she was occupied with the first group. Amateur hour. She toggled to her rockets, selected 2, and put them precisely into a cluster of boulders where thermal signatures bloomed hot. The explosion rolled down the mountainside, and she counted 3, maybe 4 figures running from cover directly into her gun sight. She didn't give them time to regret their choices. The second gun run was shorter, more surgical, 10-round bursts instead of sustained fire because ammunition management mattered when you were alone, and the nearest friendly base was 40 minutes away. The GAU-8 chewed through the new positions with mechanical efficiency, and when she pulled up this time, the valley had gone quiet except for the echo of her engines bouncing off rock walls. She climbed back to altitude, circling, scanning, waiting for someone to make a move, but the mountainside stayed still. Reaper 27, target area secure, you're clear to move. Her voice was flat, professional, already thinking about the paperwork this was going to generate, the questions about why she'd engaged without wingman support, the quiet disapproval that would never quite become official. On the ground, she knew, men were staring at the devastation she'd delivered, at the smoking craters where enemy positions had been, and maybe some of them were wondering about the pilot who just saved their lives. But probably not. Probably they were just grateful to be alive, and whoever had been flying didn't matter. It never did. Vance was on his feet before the dust settled, screaming at his team to get the vehicles moving, to push through while they had the chance. And Highland found himself stumbling through smoke and cordite stink toward the second Suburban that still had a functional engine. The security contractor from Georgia was laughing, actually laughing, shouting something about angels and warthogs and the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Highland looked up, saw the circling overhead, its distinctive twin engines and straight wings making it look like something from a previous war, and felt something shift in his understanding of how violence worked. He'd funded military charities, had sat through Pentagon briefings, had even visited bases and shaken hands with pilots, but all of that had been abstract, ceremonial, disconnected from the raw physics of what he'd just witnessed. Someone had dropped out of the sky and erased a threat that was about to kill him, had done it with such overwhelming precision that the entire ambush had lasted maybe 90 seconds from first gun run to silence. The motorcade lurched forward, tires grinding over rock and debris, and Vance was back on the radio, talking to the A-10 pilot, requesting escort to the nearest friendly position. "Copy. I'll stay with you, but be advised I'm Winchester on rockets and getting low on gun." The female voice was still calm, but there was an edge now, a transparency about limitations that somehow made Highland trust her more. They made it 3 kilometers before the second ambush triggered. This time the RPG hit the road directly in front of the lead vehicle, cratering the surface and forcing the driver to brake hard enough that the Suburban behind nearly rear-ended them. Highland was thrown against his seatbelt, head bouncing off the window, and through the ringing in his ears he heard Vance cursing in compound words that probably weren't in any official manual. The radio crackled. "I see them. Hold position. Danger close." Then the A-10 was diving again, lower this time, so low that Highland could actually see the pilot's helmet through the canopy as she screamed past at what felt like eye level. The gun fired twice, short controlled bursts, and 2 separate explosions bloomed on the hillside above them, close enough that debris rained down on the convoy's roof. "That's the last of them, but I'm dry now. Anything else pops up and I'm just a very aggressive speed bump." The pilot's voice carried a dark humor that made Vance smile despite everything. "Copy, Reaper, we're 10 minutes from Fob Caligush. Can you stick around that long?" There was a pause then. "I can stick around until I run out of sky. That's kind of the deal." Something in the way she said it made Highland lean forward made him ask Vance, "Who is that?" Vance's expression went carefully neutral, the look of someone choosing words in a minefield. "Captain Sienna Reeves, call sign Reaper. 4 deployments, more confirmed kills than anyone wants to count, and a reputation for showing up when everyone else is busy." He didn't elaborate, but the young contractor did, unable to help himself. "She's the one who stayed on station at Kandahar when her engine was literally on fire, kept flying CAS until the friendlies extracted, then ejected like 2 miles from the base. They gave her a medal and then grounded her for 3 months for violating safety protocols." Highland frowned. "Why would they ground someone for that?" Vance's smile was thin. "Because she made everyone else look like they weren't trying hard enough. Command doesn't like complicated heroes." The convoy rolled into Fob Caligush 17 minutes later, past wire and barriers and exhausted infantry who barely looked up, and overhead the A-10 waggled its wings once before turning east toward Bagram. Highland watched it disappear into the morning glare, that ugly, graceless aircraft that had kept him alive, and made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. He pulled out his satellite phone and called his assistant in New York. Time to make some inquiries about what exactly had happened at Bagram 3 months ago, and why the best pilot he'd never met was flying solo patrols over empty mountains. The debriefing happened in a plywood room that smelled like burned coffee and disappointment, with a major who looked too young for his rank and too tired for his job. Reeves sat across from him in her flight suit, helmet on the table between them, and answered questions with the minimum words required. Yes, she'd engaged without wingman support. Yes, she'd flown danger close without ground commander clearance. Yes, she was aware that doctrine existed for reasons. The major was working through a checklist, hitting every required point, and she could see he didn't actually care about any of it. This was theater, documentation to protect the chain of command if something went wrong later. You understand that you put yourself at unnecessary risk. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I understood that people would die if I didn't engage immediately." The major sighed, made a note, and closed his folder. "Captain, you did good work today." The ground commander submitted a recommendation for commendation. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're making it very difficult for anyone to defend you when you keep bending rules." Reeves met his eyes. "I haven't bent any rules, sir. I followed rules of engagement, provided close air support when requested by a qualified JTAC, and maintained weapons discipline throughout. If the problem is that I did it alone, maybe the question should be why I was alone in the first place." The major's expression flickered, something like sympathy crossing his face before disappearing into professional blankness. "You know why, Captain. The incident at Bagram was 3 months ago, has been investigated, and I was cleared of wrongdoing." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it had teeth. The major nodded slowly. "Cleared of wrongdoing isn't the same as cleared for advancement. You know how this works. You embarrass people, made them look bad, and now you're paying for it. I don't like it, but I don't make those decisions." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Take 48 hours, file your after-action report, and try to stay out of trouble. And Captain, Next time you save a billionaire's life, maybe do it with a wingman. She left the debriefing, walked across the flight line past mechanics who stopped working to watch her pass, past other pilots who nodded or didn't depending on where they stood in the complicated politics of who deserved respect and who was just trouble. She didn't acknowledge any of them, just headed to her quarters, a metal box barely big enough for a bed and a wall locker, and sat down to write the resignation letter that was becoming less theoretical with every passing day. She joined because she believed in something, because flying seemed like the purest version of service she could offer, and now here she was, the best at what she did and completely certain it didn't matter. Tomorrow there'd be another patrol, another empty sky, another mission that used her skills while making absolutely sure everyone knew she wasn't leadership material. Marcus Highland spent 3 days making phone calls, talking to colonels and contractors, pulling threads in the military bureaucracy that he'd never had reason to understand before. What he learned made him angry in a way that quarterly earnings reports never did, made him understand that competence was sometimes punished harder than failure, especially when that competence came wrapped in the wrong kind of body. The incident at Bagram had been simple. Reeves had been flying Escort for a supply convoy when intelligence got bad, when what was supposed to be a routine transport turned into an ambush that caught 2 Chinooks on the ground with 40 soldiers exposed. Her wingman had been hit, had to break off, and doctrine said she should have pulled back, waited for reinforcements, let someone else handle it. Instead, she dropped into the kill zone alone, had held off the attacking force for 18 minutes with gun runs so aggressive that one of her engines ingested debris and started failing. She'd kept flying anyway, kept putting herself between the enemy and the soldiers on the ground, until the Chinooks got airborne and the infantry made it to cover. Then she'd coaxed her dying aircraft back to base, landed it despite hydraulic failure, and written a report that used 500 words to describe what everyone who'd been there called the most skilled flying they'd ever witnessed. The colonel who'd read that report had seen a pilot who'd violated protocol, who'd risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft, who'd made the decision to ignore orders and do what she thought was right. He'd given her a Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony that felt like punishment, made a speech about heroism that carried an undertone of warning, and then quietly made sure she never flew anything important again. That was 3 months ago. Since then, Reeves had been assigned to the lowest priority patrols, the missions nobody else wanted, the long, boring circles over mountains where nothing ever happened. Until the day something did happen, and she did exactly what she'd always done, exactly what had gotten her in trouble before. Highland understood business, understood how organizations protected themselves, how they punished excellence that didn't conform, and he decided that maybe his money could be useful for something other than infrastructure projects that looked good in press releases. He made more calls, pulled different threads, and arranged a meeting with a general who owed him several favors. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and cost Highland a promise to fund 3 new schools in Kabul, but when it ended, he'd planted seeds that might grow into something better than decoration and exile. He couldn't force the Air Force to change its mind about who deserved command, but he could make sure that the people who made those decisions understood that someone was watching, that Reeves had allies they hadn't anticipated. And maybe that would be enough. Maybe it wouldn't. But at least he'd tried, which was more than he'd done for most of the people who'd ever saved his life. Reeves got the orders on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by the same major who debriefed her, and she read them twice before believing they were real. She wasn't being reprimanded, wasn't being grounded, wasn't being sent home early. Instead, she was being temporarily assigned to a training unit at Bagram, tasked with teaching close air support tactics to pilots rotating through theater. It wasn't command, wasn't promotion, wasn't anything that would fix the underlying problem of being too good at the wrong things. But it was something different than patrol circles over empty mountains, and different was enough for now. The major was watching her read, and when she looked up, he was almost smiling. Someone high up decided you're wasting potential out here. Don't make me regret delivering good news." She folded the orders carefully, tucked them into her pocket, and allowed herself the smallest acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, the universe occasionally bent toward something like justice. "I'll try, sir." She packed her gear that evening, said goodbye to exactly nobody, because there was nobody to say goodbye to, and caught a transport to Bagram the next morning. The flight took 40 minutes, and she spent it looking out the window at mountains that all looked the same, at valleys where people had fought and died for reasons that shifted depending on who was telling the story, and thought about what it meant to be good at something that mostly involved destroying things. She'd never wanted to be a warrior, had never romanticized violence, but she'd learned that she had a gift for it, a spatial awareness and mechanical sympathy that let her do things with aircraft that other pilots couldn't imagine. And now someone, somewhere, had decided that gift was worth passing on. The training unit operated out of a corner of Bagram that looked like every other military installation, prefab buildings and orderly chaos, but the pilots were different. These were men and women rotating into combat zones, nervous and overeager, and absolutely certain they understood what they were about to face. Reeves's job was to make them less certain, to teach them that textbook solutions didn't survive contact with reality, that the enemy always got a vote, that close air support meant putting yourself between friendlies and death with margins so thin they were measured in seconds. She taught them in classrooms, showing gun camera footage and breaking down decisions frame by frame, explaining why she'd chosen this angle instead of that one, this weapon instead of that one, this risk instead of the safer option that would have arrived too late. She taught them in simulators, throwing impossible scenarios at them until they stopped freezing, stopped overthinking, stopped waiting for permission to do what obviously needed doing. And she taught them in the air, flying beside them as they practiced runs on target ranges, watching them make mistakes she'd made years ago, offering corrections that were direct without being cruel. The pilots were mostly younger than her, but some were older, men with more rank who struggled with taking instruction from a captain who'd been sidelined, and she learned to read the ones who'd listen versus the ones who'd resent her for having answers they didn't. She was patient with the former, ruthlessly efficient with the latter, and within 2 weeks had developed a reputation for being the instructor everyone wanted and nobody wanted to disappoint. 3 weeks into the assignment, a captain named Tors approached her after a sim session, his expression somewhere between respect and confusion. "How do you do it? The thing where you're tracking 3 different threats while talking to ground and managing weapons and reading terrain, all at the same time?" Reeves considered the question, recognizing it as genuine rather than rhetorical. "You stop thinking about it as separate tasks. It's one task with multiple inputs, and you train until the inputs don't require conscious processing. Like driving a car while having a conversation, you're not actually splitting attention, you're just letting different parts of your brain handle different things." Tors frowned. "But some of those decisions are life and death. You can't just run them on autopilot." She nodded. "That's where the training comes in. You practice until the fundamentals are automatic, until the aircraft is an extension of your body, and then your conscious mind is free to handle the actual tactical problems. The guys who struggle are usually the ones overthinking the mechanics." She could see him processing this, comparing it to his own approach, and she felt something shift in the conversation, the dynamic going from student-teacher to pilot-pilot. "You ever get scared up there? When it's really bad?" She met his eyes. "Every single time. Fear is just information, tells you something matters enough to be careful about it. The trick is using it instead of letting it use you." They talked for another 20 minutes about fear and focus and the strange mathematics of violence, and when Tors finally left, he thanked her with the sincerity of someone who just learned something worth knowing. The weeks accumulated into months, and Reeves found herself settling into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable, teaching pilots who'd go on to fly missions she'd never be part of, passing along hard-won knowledge that would keep some of them alive. She wasn't patrolling anymore, wasn't racking up combat hours or adding to her reputation, but she was useful in a way that felt different than what she'd been doing before. The other instructors treated her with careful respect, the kind that came from understanding she'd been sent here as punishment that somehow turned into opportunity, and she navigated the social dynamics with the same tactical awareness she brought to flying. She didn't make friends, didn't socialize beyond what professionalism required, but she built something like mutual regard with a few of the other captains who'd also learned that competence could be complicated. One of them, a pilot named Chen who'd flown Apache before transferring to fixed wing, told her over bad coffee one morning, "You know they're watching you, right? Whoever pulled strings to get you this assignment, they're waiting to see if you can stay out of trouble long enough to matter." Reeves sipped the coffee, which tasted like it had been brewed with motor oil and regret. "I'm not trying to stay out of trouble, I'm just doing my job." Chen smiled. "Yeah, that's what worries them." 4 months into the assignment, a lieutenant colonel showed up unannounced during one of her classroom sessions, stood in the back watching her break down a gun run that had gone wrong in a way that got soldiers killed. She didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept teaching, walking the pilots through the decision points where the attacking pilot had chosen speed over precision, had trusted old intelligence over real-time observation, had made mistakes that compounded until they became tragedy. When the class ended, the colonel asked to speak with her privately. They walked across the flight line, past aircraft being armed and fueled, and he didn't speak until they were alone by a bunker that smelled like JP-8 and sun-baked concrete. "I've been reviewing your training outcomes, Captain. Your students perform measurably better in live exercises than pilots trained by other instructors. Fewer errors, better tactical awareness, more aggressive but also more controlled." He paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. "You have a gift for teaching that's almost as rare as your gift for flying. The question is what we do with that." Reeves kept her expression neutral, waiting for whatever was coming next, the promotion or the letdown or the new set of restrictions she hadn't anticipated. The colonel watched her, reading something in her stillness. "I'm not here to offer you a squadron because we both know that's not happening. Not with your record, and not with the people who have decided you're too much risk to trust with command. But I am here to tell you that training matters, that you're shaping the pilots who will be flying CAS for the next 5 years, and that's worth something." It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it was honest, and honesty counted for something in a system built on careful omissions. "Understood, sir." The colonel nodded, started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it's worth, Captain, I've read your file front to back, including the classified portions. You did the right thing at Bagram, and the right thing before that, and the right thing last week when you pulled that convoy out of the fire. The fact that doing the right thing keeps getting you in trouble says more about us than it does about you." He left her standing by the bunker, and she watched the sun drop toward the mountains, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if she'd had the energy to appreciate beauty, and thought about legacies and limitations, and the difference between what she'd wanted from this career and what it had actually given her. She'd wanted to fly, wanted to be useful, wanted to matter in some concrete way that didn't require politics or performance. And she'd gotten that mostly, even if it came wrapped in frustration and artificial ceilings. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. She returned to her quarters and didn't write the resignation letter, not because anything had fundamentally changed, but because teaching pilots to stay alive felt like purpose enough for now, and purpose was getting harder to find. She fell asleep planning the next day's lesson, thinking about a gun run she'd show them, and dreamed of mountains that stretched forever. 6 months after the convoy rescue, Marcus Highland flew into Bagram on a civilian contractor flight, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that made him look exactly like what he was, a billionaire trying to blend in and failing. He'd arranged the visit through official channels, framing it as an inspection of reconstruction projects, but his real agenda was simpler. He wanted to meet the pilot who'd saved his life, wanted to understand what happened to people who were good at necessary things in an organization that preferred comfortable mediocrity. It took 3 days of navigating military bureaucracy before he finally sat across from Captain Sienna Reeves in a conference room that smelled like floor wax and ancient air conditioning. And when he saw her in person for the first time, his primary thought was that she looked exactly like someone who'd made peace with being underestimated. She was compact, efficient in her movements, with eyes that tracked everything and committed to nothing. Mr. Highland. Her voice was the same one he'd heard on the radio 6 months ago, calm and inflectionless. He smiled, trying to establish some kind of connection. Captain Reeves, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did in Cunnar. My security chief tells me we were about 30 seconds from being overrun when you arrived. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting its implications. I was doing my job, sir. I'm glad you made it out. He studied her, trying to reconcile this careful distance with the aggressive violence she'd deployed so precisely. I've been making inquiries about your career. Seems like you're very good at your job in ways that make people uncomfortable. Reeves's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a tightening that suggested he'd stepped into territory she didn't appreciate civilians exploring. With respect, sir, my career isn't something I discuss with people outside the chain of command. Highland leaned back, recognizing the deflection for what it was. I'm not trying to interfere, Captain. I'm trying to understand. You saved my life, and from what I've learned, you've saved a lot of lives, and the reward for that seems to be exile to training duty and a reputation as someone who can't be trusted with advancement. That doesn't make sense to me. She was quiet for a moment, weighing responses, and when she spoke her voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. It makes perfect sense, Mr. Highland. I'm good at what I do, which means when I do it, other people look like they're not trying hard enough. The system doesn't reward that kind of competence. It isolates it, contains it, makes sure it doesn't spread or make anyone else look bad. And honestly, I'm fine with that. I get to fly, I get to teach pilots who will actually use what I know, and I don't have to navigate whatever politics come with command. It's not what I wanted, but it's what I got, and complaining about it won't change anything. Highland found himself respecting her more for the bitterness she didn't try to hide. What if it could change? What if you had support from people who don't care about protecting egos? She met his eyes directly, and he saw calculation happening behind her careful neutrality. Then I'd say those people don't understand how the military works, how any large organization works. You can't fix institutional problems with individual intervention, and trying usually just makes things worse for the person you're trying to help. It was a polite way of telling him to mind his own business, and Highland recognized it as such, but he pressed anyway. I've funded scholarships for pilots, programs that identify talent and give it resources. What if there was something like that for instructors, recognition that teaching matters as much as leading? Reeves tilted her head slightly, considering. That might actually help if it was structured right, if it didn't look like an end run around normal promotion processes. But you'd need buy-in from command, from the people who decide what matters and what doesn't, and I'm not sure why they'd support something that highlights how they've been managing talent. Highland smiled. Leave that part to me. You just keep teaching pilots to fly like you do, and I'll work on making sure someone's paying attention. They talked for another hour, about training methodologies and resource constraints, and the specific challenges of preparing pilots for combat in terrain that killed mistakes instantly. And by the end of it, Highland had committed to funding a pilot excellence program that would recognize outstanding instructors and give them resources to develop advanced training modules. It wasn't command, wasn't promotion, but it was visibility, and visibility sometimes mattered more than rank. Reeves walked him to his transport, past mechanics and ordnance crews who recognized him and straightened slightly, responding to wealth the way soldiers responded to rank. And at the aircraft he turned to say something final. Captain, I've met a lot of competent people in my life, people who are good at what they do, but competence without courage is just efficiency. You have both, and that's rare enough that it should be protected, celebrated, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Thank you for my life, and for whoever else you save who'll never know your name. He climbed aboard before she could respond, and she watched the aircraft taxi away, feeling something complicated that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite resentment. She'd learned to live with invisibility, had made peace with doing essential work that nobody celebrated, and now someone was threatening that equilibrium by suggesting she deserved recognition she'd stopped expecting. It was dangerous, that kind of hope, because hope required believing things could improve, and belief created vulnerability she couldn't afford. She walked back across the flight line toward her next class, already compartmentalizing the conversation, already deciding it didn't matter what Highland did or didn't do. She'd keep teaching, keep flying when they let her, keep being useful in whatever capacity they'd permit. And if that never added up to the career she'd imagined, well, most people's lives didn't match their expectations. The important thing was the work, the actual transmission of knowledge that might keep pilots alive, and that didn't require recognition or reward. It just required showing up and being honest about what worked and what killed people, and she could do that regardless of whether anyone was watching. 8 months later, the program launched with a ceremony at Bagram that featured a General Reeves had never met, a plaque with her name on it, and a speech about the importance of cultivating excellence that managed to avoid mentioning why excellence needed cultivating in the first place. She stood at attention in her dress uniform, feeling awkward and visible in ways that made her skin itch, while cameras recorded footage that would be used in recruitment materials and congressional presentations. Afterward, junior pilots approached her with something like reverence, asking for advice and autographs and stories about missions she couldn't discuss, and she navigated the attention with the same tactical awareness she brought to flying, pleasant but distant, acknowledging their enthusiasm without encouraging dependence. Marcus Highland attended via video link, his face on a screen looking pleased with himself, and she made herself smile and thank him because that was protocol, even though part of her resented the whole production. But the program came with resources, actual budget for developing training scenarios and bringing in subject matter experts, and she couldn't resent that, couldn't reject tools that would make her teaching more effective. So she smiled and thanked people and posed for photographs, and when it was finally over, she went back to her quarters and sat in silence for 20 minutes, letting the performance drain out of her system before pulling out her lesson plans for the next day's class. The program worked, or at least it appeared to work in the metrics that command cared about. Pilot performance in combat scenarios improved, casualty rates among newly deployed aviators decreased, and the training unit at Bagram developed a reputation for producing pilots who could handle chaos without falling apart. Reeves taught with the same intensity she'd always brought to flying, demanding precision and punishing sloppiness, and her students either rose to her standard or washed out early enough that they didn't get anyone killed. She was teaching a class on weapons employment when the call came through, a satellite phone message that pulled her out mid-lecture to take a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and brought news that shouldn't have surprised her but somehow did. "Captain Reeves, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez from Air Force Personnel Command. I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected for promotion to Major, effective next month. Congratulations." Reeves stood in the hallway holding the phone, trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of how her career worked, and must have been quiet too long because the colonel continued. "I know this is unexpected, given your previous circumstances, but the review board was unanimous. Your training outcomes and the pilot excellence program made it impossible to ignore your contributions, and sometimes the system actually works the way it's supposed to." Reeves found her voice. "Thank you, ma'am, thank you." It was inadequate, but it was all she had. The colonel's tone shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Captain, I've read your file, including the parts that explain why you've been overlooked for so long. What happened to you was unfair, and while this promotion doesn't erase that, I hope it at least indicates that some people are paying attention. You've earned this, probably earned it several times over. Don't let anyone tell you differently." They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and timing, and when Reeves finally hung up, she stood in the empty hallway trying to identify what she was feeling. Not happiness exactly, not vindication, just a tired satisfaction that maybe, finally, doing the right things had led to right outcomes. She returned to her classroom where pilots were waiting, young men and women who'd learned to trust her judgment even when it challenged their assumptions. And she finished the lecture on weapons employment without mentioning the call. But word spread anyway, the way everything spread on military bases, and by evening other instructors were congratulating her, some genuinely pleased, others carefully neutral, everyone calibrating their response based on complicated social calculations about who deserved success and who'd merely gotten lucky. Chen found her after dinner, brought 2 beers he'd acquired through means he didn't explain, and they sat outside her quarters watching the sun disappear behind mountains that looked the same as they had a year ago, 5 years ago, forever. You going to stay in training, or are you angling for a squadron now? Chen's question was casual, but she heard the real inquiry underneath it. She considered her answer carefully. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to prove I can lead, that all those people who said I wasn't command material were wrong. But another part of me thinks I'm more useful here, teaching pilots who will actually use what I know, than I'd be managing administrative paperwork and flight schedules. Chen nodded slowly. That's probably the right answer, which means you've matured or gotten cynical, possibly both. They drank in comfortable silence. 2 pilots who'd learned that careers rarely followed planned trajectories, and eventually Chen left, and Reeves sat alone with her thoughts and her uncertain future. The promotion ceremony was smaller than the program launch, just her squadron commander and a handful of other instructors, and Reeves barely registered the moment when the major's oak leaves replaced her captain's bars. What mattered more was the conversation afterward, when her commander pulled her aside and asked about her intentions. "Major, you've done exceptional work here, but training slots don't usually lead to squadron command, and I suspect you know that. The question is whether you want to stay in an instructor role or take a staff position that might lead somewhere else." Reeves had been thinking about this for weeks, running scenarios the way she'd run mission profiles, trying to identify the path that maximized utility while minimizing frustration. "I want to stay in training, sir. I'm good at it. The pilots benefit from it. And honestly, I don't think I have the temperament for staff work or the politics that come with squadron command. If that means I've hit my ceiling, I can live with that." Her commander studied her, looking for doubt or resentment, and apparently satisfied with what he found, nodded. "That's probably wise, and for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Good instructors are rarer than good commanders, and you have a gift for teaching that shouldn't be wasted on PowerPoint presentations and budget meetings. We'll keep you here as long as you want to stay." It was permission to stop climbing, to find satisfaction in work rather than rank, and Reeves accepted it with something like relief. The months continued their steady accumulation, pilots rotating through her classes, and then deploying to actual combat where some of them would use her lessons, and some would die anyway because training couldn't eliminate chaos, only prepare people to navigate it slightly better. She received letters occasionally, messages from pilots who'd survived situations they credited to something she'd taught them, and she kept those letters in a folder she never looked at, because looking at them felt like accepting credit for outcomes that depended on hundreds of variables beyond her instruction. She preferred to focus on the next class, the next simulation, the next opportunity to transfer knowledge that might matter in ways she'd never see. Marcus Highland visited twice more, bringing congressional staffers and defense contractors who wanted to see the program they'd funded, and each time she gave them the tour and the statistics and the carefully prepared remarks about the importance of investing in training infrastructure. She played the role they needed her to play, the success story that justified their investment, and in return they left her alone to do the actual work that mattered. It was a transaction she could live with, trading visibility for autonomy, and she'd learned that most worthwhile things required compromise anyway. The question was whether you were compromising principles or merely tactics, and as long as she could teach pilots to stay alive, she was comfortable with whatever tactical concessions that required. She'd stopped writing resignation letters, stopped imagining careers that led to fighter wings or command positions, and found something like peace in being exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was good at, for reasons that didn't require validation from people who'd never understand why it mattered. 3 years into her training assignment, on a morning that started like every other morning, Reeves was walking to the flight line when a young lieutenant approached her, nervous and overeager in the way of people who'd heard stories but hadn't yet learned to separate truth from mythology. "Major Reeves, I just got assigned to your advanced CAS course, and I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen, and I've heard." Reeves held up a hand, cutting off whatever hero worship was about to emerge. "Lieutenant, whatever you've heard is probably exaggerated or outdated, and either way it doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can learn to put weapons on target without killing the people you're supposed to protect. Everything else is just noise." The lieutenant blinked, recalibrating her approach, and Reeves felt a familiar exhaustion. She'd been doing this for 3 years, had taught hundreds of pilots, and the ones who arrived expecting war stories were almost always the ones who struggled most with actual tactical thinking. But something in the lieutenant's expression made her soften slightly. "You fly warthogs," Chen nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I requested A-10 specifically because of your record," Reeves sighed. "Then you requested them for the wrong reasons. The A-10 is a specific tool for specific problems, and if you're flying it because you want to be like someone you've never met, you're going to get people killed. But if you're flying it because you understand close air support matters more than glory, and you're willing to put yourself between friendlies and death with margins thin enough to make you pray, then maybe you'll be worth the fuel we'll spend training you." The lieutenant straightened slightly, and Reeves saw her processing the correction, deciding whether to be offended or educated, and when she chose the latter, Reeves allowed herself a small nod. "Class starts in 30 minutes, don't be late." She walked away before Chen could respond, already thinking about the day's lesson plan, already forgetting the conversation, because it was just one more variation on a pattern she'd seen dozens of times. Behind her, Lieutenant Chen watched her go, understanding for the first time that reputation was a different thing than reality, and that the pilot she'd heard about and the officer she'd just met might share a name but had been shaped by experiences that no one else would ever fully understand.